The heavy oak doors of courtroom 302 in King County, Washington, were locked tight, but the gasp that echoed from within made the bailiffs outside flinch. Sarah Miller had walked into that room, a broken woman clutching a tissue and praying for a miracle, while her husband's mistress sat in the front row, checking her watch with a look of bored superiority. It was supposed to be a standard custody hearing. It was supposed to be the day Sarah lost everything to a man who had systematically dismantled her life. Instead, Judge Frederick Halloway looked over his spectacles, paused the proceedings, and delivered a single sentence that turned the predator into the prey. What happened next wasn't just a legal ruling, it was a revelation that exposed a crime so dark the police were waiting by the exit before the gavel even hit the sound block. On the morning of November 14th, 2023, the sky over Seattle was the color of a bruised plum. Rain lashed against the tall, imposing windows of the King County Superior Court, blurring the city skyline into a gray smudge. Inside courtroom 302, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air conditioning hummed with a low, menacing drone, doing little to cool the heated tension that filled the room. Sarah Miller sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands trembling so violently she had to clasp them together in her lap to keep them still. She was 34, but in the harsh, fluorescent lighting of the court, she looked 50. Her blonde hair, once her pride, was pulled back in a severe, messy bun, and the grey suit she wore, bought at a thrift store 2 days prior, because her husband had frozen her credit cards hung loosely on her gaunt frame. To her right sat her attorney, David Ross. David was a public defender, overworked and underpaid, with a coffee stain on his tie, and a stack of files he had only received 48 hours ago. He was a good man, but he looked exhausted. He was up against a shark. Across the aisle, sitting at the defense table, was Richard Miller. Richard looked like he had just stepped out of a magazine spread for high-end real estate. His navy blue Italian suit was tailored to perfection, hugging his broad shoulders. His dark hair was gelled back, not a strand out of place. He sat with an air of relaxed confidence, occasionally leaning over to whisper something to his lawyer, Ms. Caldwell. Miss Caldwell was known in the legal circles of Washington as the Butcher. She didn't just win cases, she annihilated the opposition. She cost $500 an hour a fee paid from the joint bank account that Sarah no longer had access to. "All rise!" The bailiff bellowed, his voice bouncing off the mahogany walls. Judge Frederick Halloway entered the room. He was a man of imposing stature, nearing 70, with a face lined by decades of listening to lies. He had a reputation for being harsh, impatient, and utterly intolerant of theatrics. He adjusted his robe, sat down, and peered over his reading glasses at the assembly. "Be seated," Halloway grumbled, shuffling the papers in front of him. "We are here for the matter of Miller versus Miller. Custody hearing and finalized divorce proceedings. I've reviewed the motions. Let's not waste time. Mr. Ross, your client, looks like she's about to faint. Is she fit to proceed?" Sarah flinched. She tried to sit up straighter, but her body felt heavy, leaden with months of insomnia. "Yes, Your Honor." David Ross stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Mrs. Miller is simply distressed. The circumstances of this separation have been extreme." "Distressed?" Miss Caldwell shot up her voice, smooth like velvet, wrapped around a razor blade. "Your Honor, with all due respect, distressed is a mild way to put it. We are here to prove that Mrs. Miller is mentally unstable, chemically dependent, and an immediate danger to her 2 children, Liam and Sophia. We have the toxicology reports, the police statements from the night of October 3rd, and witness testimony." Sarah squeezed her eyes shut. The night of October 3rd. The night everything shattered. It had been a setup. She knew it in her bones. She had come home to find the house tossed a bottle of vodka she didn't buy sitting empty on the counter, and the police banging on the door because of an anonymous tip about child neglect. Her blood alcohol level had been 0, but the police report noted erratic behavior because she had been screaming that her husband was gaslighting her. "We will get to the evidence, Ms. Caldwell," Judge Holloway said, waving a hand dismissively. "But first I want to hear from the parties involved. Mrs. Miller, look at me." Sarah raised her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed, swollen from crying. "Why are you here today, Mrs. Miller?" the judge asked, his voice unexpectedly soft, though his eyes remained sharp. I want my children, Your Honor," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't do the things he says. I don't drink. I've never hurt my babies. Richard, he's trying to erase me." Richard let out a small, audible sigh, shaking his head, sadly performing for the court. "Erase you?" Judge Holloway raised an eyebrow. "That is a dramatic term. He took my money. He took my car. He changed the locks." Sarah's voice gained a fraction of strength, and he moved her in before my side of the bed was even cold. The courtroom went silent. Sarah's eyes darted to the gallery to the front row. There she sat. Chloe Evans was 24, stunningly beautiful, with raven black hair cascading over a red designer jacket. She sat with her legs crossed, inspecting her manicured fingernails. She didn't look like a mistress. She looked like the new model that had replaced the old one. When Sarah looked at her, Chloe didn't look away. She smirked. A tiny, imperceptible curling of the lips that said, "I won." Judge Holloway followed Sarah's gaze. He looked at Chloe, his expression unreadable. For a fleeting second, his eyes narrowed, as if he were trying to recall a face from a long-forgotten memory. But the moment passed. "Let's proceed with the opening statements," the judge said, turning back to the lawyers. Sarah felt a cold pit in her stomach. She had no idea that the woman sitting in the front row, the woman she hated more than anyone on earth, was about to become the centerpiece of the most shocking legal pivot in Seattle history. The morning session was a bloodbath. Ms. Caldwell didn't just dismantle Sarah's character, she incinerated it. Exhibit A was a series of text messages sent from Sarah's phone to Richard. They were vile, abusive, and riddled with incoherent ramblings. "I'll burn the house down with you in it. I hope you die. The kids hate you." Sarah stared at the projection screen, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't send those," she cried out, ignoring her lawyer's hand on her arm. "He cloned my phone. He works in tech security. He knows how to do this." Order Judge Holloway slammed his gavel. "Mrs. Miller outburst again, and I will hold you in contempt." "But, Your Honor, it's not true." "Then let your lawyer prove it," Holloway snapped. Richard took the stand at 11 a.m. He walked with the confident stride of a man who owned the room. He was sworn in, placing a hand on the Bible, with a solemnity that made Sarah want to vomit. "Mr. Miller," Mrs. Caldwell began walking back and forth in front of the witness stand. "Tell the court about your marriage." Richard adjusted his tie. He looked at the judge, his eyes wide and sincere. "I loved Sarah. I really did. For 10 years I tried to help her. But after her mother passed away last year, she broke. She started drinking. She became paranoid. She started accusing me of having affairs with everyone, the nanny, my secretary, the barista." "And were you having affairs?" Caldwell asked. "Never," Richard said firmly. "I was working 80-hour weeks to build our development firm, Miller & Sons, to provide for her and the kids. I came home to find her passed out on the sofa, the kids hungry and crying. It broke my heart." Sarah sobbed quietly into her hands. It was a lie, all of it. Richard had been draining their accounts for 2 years. Miller & Sons wasn't just a development firm. It was a shell game of LLCs and offshore accounts. Sarah had found the bank statements 3 months ago, statements showing transfers of hundreds of thousands of dollars to an account under the name C.E. Holdings. When she had confronted him, he hadn't denied it. He had smiled and told her that if she told anyone, he'd make sure she was institutionalized. "Mr. Miller," Caldwell continued, "who is Chloe Evans?" Richard glanced toward the audience, offering a warm, protective smile to the mistress. "Chloe was my assistant. She stepped in to help with the children when Sarah was indisposed. She has been a rock, a stability that Liam and Sophia desperately needed. Yes, after Sarah and I separated, our relationship became personal. But only after. So Miss Evans is a stabilizing force. Absolutely. The children adore her." David Ross. Sarah's lawyer stood up for cross-examination. He looked nervous. "Mr. Miller." Ross began shuffling his papers. "You claim you never had an affair before the separation, yet we have credit card receipts showing a trip to Cabo San Lucas in July of 2023. You were booked into the honeymoon suite. The guest list shows 2 people. Richard didn't flinch. "I took a business partner. It was a corporate retreat. A corporate retreat in a honeymoon suite. It was the only room available. It was peak season, and the diamond necklace purchased on that trip, valued at $12,000, a gift for my mother." Richard lied smoothly. "Your mother passed away in 2018. Ross pointed out, finally landing a blow. The courtroom murmured. Richard's jaw tightened. "I meant, it was a donation to her memorial charity auction." "We can check that," Ross pressed. "Objection," Caldwell interjected. "Relevance. We are here to discuss custody and Mrs. Miller's competency, not my client's charitable endeavors." "Sustained," Judge Holloway said, though he was writing something down on his notepad. He didn't look up. "Move on, Mr. Ross." Sarah felt hope shrinking. The judge didn't care about the affair. He cared about the kids, and Richard had painted a picture of a wealthy, stable father versus a hysterical, broke mother. Then came the financial discussion. "Mr. Miller," Ross tried again. "My client claims there are missing funds. Nearly $2 million from the joint equity line. Investments," Richard said, shrugging. "Real estate is a volatile market. We took some losses. Sarah signed off on all of them." "I forged nothing," Sarah shouted, unable to help herself. "He has a machine. He traced my signature." "Mrs. Miller." Judge Holloway's voice was like a thunderclap. "One more word, and you will be removed." He looked at her, and for a second, Sarah saw something different in his eyes. Pity. Or was it annoyance? "The court will recess for lunch," Holloway announced. "When we return, I want to hear from the witness, Miss Evans. I want to understand the environment the children will be entering if I grant custody to the father." As everyone stood, Richard leaned over to Sarah as he passed her table. "Give it up, Sarah," he whispered, his voice low and cold. "You're embarrassing yourself. Go check yourself into a clinic. It's the only way you'll ever see pictures of the kids again." Sarah slumped in her chair, watching him walk away, his hand resting on the small of Chloe's back. Chloe turned and flashed that smile again. But Sarah noticed something she hadn't seen before. Chloe's hand was shaking. Just a little. She was clutching her designer purse so tightly her knuckles were white. Why was the mistress nervous? She was winning. The afternoon session began with the rain beating even harder against the glass. The courtroom was dimmer now, the shadows lengthening. "Defense calls Chloe Evans to the stand," Ms. Caldwell announced. The sound of Chloe's heels clicking on the hardwood floor echoed through the silent room. Click, click, click. She walked with a runway model's grace, stepping into the witness box and taking the oath. "State your name for the record," the clerk said. "Chloe Marie Evans," she said. Her voice was higher than Sarah expected, almost girlish. "Miss Evans," Caldwell began, smiling warmly. "How long have you known Mr. Miller?" "About 2 years," Chloe said. "I started as an intern at Miller & Sons." "And describe your relationship with the children, Liam and Sophia." Chloe smiled, tucking a strand of black hair behind her ear. "Oh, they are angels. I love them like they were my own. We bake cookies, we do homework. Liam struggles with math, so I hired a tutor for him. Sophia loves ballet, so I take her to practice." She was perfect. She was the stepmother from a fairy tale, the good kind. Sarah felt sick. Sophia hated ballet. Sophia wanted to play soccer. Richard had forced her into ballet because he thought soccer was unladylike. Chloe wasn't listening to the kids. She was molding them into Richard's perfect image. "Miss Evans," Caldwell continued, "have you ever witnessed Mrs. Miller interacting with the children?" "Yes." Chloe said, her face darkening with feigned sadness. "A few times. When she came to pick them up, she was usually screaming, smelling of alcohol. The kids would hide behind my legs. It was heartbreaking. Lies. Pure, unadulterated lies." "Thank you, nothing further." Caldwell sat down, looking triumphant. David Ross stood up. He looked at his notes. He knew he had nothing on Chloe. She had no criminal record, no history of drug use. She was a ghost. "Miss Evans," Ross began, "you are 24. You live in a penthouse apartment in Bellevue. The rent is $6,000 a month. How do you afford that on an intern's salary?" Chloe stiffened. I have family money, an inheritance." "From whom?" "My grandmother." "And your relationship with Mr. Miller, did it overlap with his marriage?" "No," Chloe said sharply. "Richard was emotionally separated long before we became involved. But physically he was living in the house with his wife. Living, yes. Loving, no." Chloe shot a glance at Sarah, a look of pure venom. Judge Halloway was watching Chloe. He wasn't taking notes anymore. He was leaning back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled under his chin, his eyes narrowed into slits. He was studying her face, specifically, a small scar above her left eyebrow, and the unique, heavy silver pendant she wore around her neck. It was a vintage piece shaped like a fractured star. "Mr. Ross?" Judge Halloway interrupted. "Pause for a moment." The lawyer stopped. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge didn't look at the lawyer. He kept his eyes locked on Chloe. The silence in the room stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. The air pressure seemed to drop. "Ms. Evans," the judge said. His voice was no longer the bored, grumpy rumble of the morning. It was sharp, clear, and dangerous. "Yes." Chloe shifted in her seat. Her confidence wavered. "You said your name is Chloe Marie Evans." "Yes, Your Honor." "And you are from where?" "Portland, Oregon." "Portland," Halloway repeated. He slowly opened a drawer in his bench and pulled out a file, not the case file for Miller versus Miller, but a different folder. A thin, red folder that looked old. He opened it, glanced at a photo inside, and then looked back at Chloe. "Miss Evans, I have a very good memory for faces. But more importantly, I have an excellent memory for jewelry." Richard Miller sat up straighter at the defense table. He looked confused. He whispered something to his lawyer. "I'm sorry." Chloe laughed nervously. "It's just a necklace. Richard gave it to me." "Did he?" Halloway asked. "Interesting, because that necklace is a custom piece, a fractured star. It was commissioned in 2019 by a man named Gregory Vance for his daughter." The colour drained from Chloe's face so fast it looked like she had been slapped. "I don't know who that is," she stammered. "Don't you—" Holloway's voice dropped an octave. Because Gregory Vance was a client of Miller and Sons. He was a developer who went bankrupt 4 years ago after an alleged Ponzi scheme involving his partner. He committed suicide 3 days after he lost his home. His daughter disappeared shortly after. Sarah looked from the judge to Chloe. Chloe was trembling. Richard had stopped whispering. He was staring at the judge, his face a mask of sudden dawning horror. "Ms. Evans," the judge continued, leaning forward. "Or should I call you by your real name?" I... Chloe couldn't speak. She looked at Richard for help, but Richard was paralyzed. Judge Holloway picked up a piece of paper. "I'm going to ask you one question, and I suggest you think very carefully about your answer. Because perjury in my courtroom carries a sentence of 5 years, but being an accomplice to what I suspect is happening here carries a sentence of 20. The room was so quiet you could hear the rain hitting the glass like bullets. "Ms. Evans," Holloway said, "does the defendant, Mr. Richard Miller, know that you are currently wearing the jewelry of the man he is suspected of defrauding, and that you have been recording every single conversation you've had with him for the last 6 months? The twist. It wasn't a question. It was a grenade. Richard Miller jumped to his feet. "What?" Chloe burst into tears. She didn't look at Sarah. She looked at Richard, and the look wasn't love anymore. It was pure, unadulterated hatred. "Sit down, Mr. Miller," the bailiff shouted, moving toward him. "She's lying." Richard screamed, his face turning purple. "She's a nobody." "I'm not a nobody," Chloe screamed back, her voice breaking into a shriek that tore through the courtroom. She stood up in the witness box, shaking. "My name isn't Chloe, it's Jessica Vance, and you killed my father." Sarah gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. The judge banged his gavel, but it was just noise in the chaos. Chloe knew Jessica reached into her blouse and pulled out a small black digital recorder that had been taped to her chest. She ripped it off and slammed it onto the railing of the witness stand. "It's all on here," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Richard. "The offshore accounts. The bribes. The plan to frame Sarah. He told me everything because he thought I was just some stupid girl he could use. He didn't know who I was." Judge Holloway stood up, his towering figure casting a shadow over the bench. "Bailiff," Holloway roared, "secure the defendant. Nobody leaves this room." The silence that followed Jessica's scream was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, like the air in a room where a weapon has just been discharged. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The court reporter's hands hovered over her steno machine, her mouth slightly agape. The bailiff, a burly man named Deputy Reynolds, had his hand on his taser, his eyes darting between Richard Miller and the sobbing woman in the witness box. Richard Miller, the man who had walked into the courtroom, checking his watch and adjusting his silk tie, now looked like a cornered animal. His face was a mask of slick sweat and rapidly crumbling arrogance. He looked at Ms. Caldwell, his high-priced butcher of a lawyer, but she had taken a distinct step away from him. In the legal world, there is a line between defending a scumbag and being an accessory to a felony. Miss Caldwell knew exactly where that line was, and Richard had just dragged her miles past it. "This is insanity," Richard shouted, his voice cracking. "She's unstable. She's clearly having a psychotic break, Judge. You cannot seriously entertain this theater." Judge Frederick Holloway didn't yell. He didn't bang his gavel again. He simply sat down, the leather of his chair creaking loudly in the hush. He looked terrifyingly calm. "Mr. Miller," Holloway said, his voice dropping to a gravelly low that vibrated through the floorboards. In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen theatre. I have seen outbursts. I have seen lies. But I have never seen a witness incriminate themselves in a conspiracy to commit fraud just to prove a point. You will sit down, or Deputy Reynolds will assist you. Richard sat. He collapsed, really falling back into his chair, as if his strings had been cut. Holloway turned his gaze to the witness box. Jessica, formerly known as Chloe, was wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. The facade of the vapid trophy mistress was gone. In its place was a woman made of steel and grief. "Ms. Hayes," Holloway said, correcting himself to use her legal name, which he had found in the file. "You claim this device contains evidence of criminal activity." "It contains everything," Jessica said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "For 6 months I have been wearing a wire. Not for the police, for me. I wanted to make sure that when I buried him he stayed dead." "Bring it here," Holloway ordered. The bailiff took the small black recorder from the witness stand and walked it up to the bench. He plugged it into the court's audio system. "Objection!" Ms. Caldwell cried out, though her heart clearly wasn't in it. "Your Honor, this is admissible. It's an unauthorized recording. Washington is a two-party consent state. If my client didn't know he was being recorded, this is illegal wiretapping." Holloway peered over his glasses. "Under RCW 9.73.030, there is an exception for recordings that convey threats of bodily harm or unlawful requests. If this tape contains evidence of a major felony involving fraud or violence, the privacy expectation is waived. I will hear it in camera, or I will hear it now. Given the gravity of the accusations regarding the safety of the children, I am playing it now." He pressed play. Static hissed through the courtroom speakers. Then the sound of a car engine humming. And then Richard's voice. It was unmistakable. He sounded relaxed, smug, the voice of a man who thought he was untouchable. "Recording starts, Richard. Stop worrying, babe. Sarah isn't going to get a dime. I've structured it so she looks like a liability. The accounts in the Caymans are under a shell corp. Redwood LLC. By the time the forensic accountants look, the money will be in crypto." Jessica on tape. "But what if she fights? What if she gets a good lawyer?" "Richard, she won't. I've been gaslighting her for 2 years, Chloe. I moved her keys. I hid her meds. I spiked her evening tea with just enough antihistamines to make her slur her words when she picked up the kids. Everyone thinks she's a drunk. Even her own lawyer thinks she's a mess. It's over. I win." Jessica. And the old debt, the Vance problem. Richard A. Dark chuckle. "Gregory Vance was a weak man. He didn't have the stomach for the game. I didn't kill him, Chloe. I just gave him a gentle push toward the edge. He signed the transfer deeds to the lakeside property 2 hours before he pulled the trigger. Legal, maybe not. Enforceable. Absolutely." Recording ends. The click of the tape stopping was the loudest sound Sarah Miller had ever heard. She sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, her hands covering her mouth. The tears that flowed now weren't from sadness. They were from the sheer, overwhelming shock of validation. "I'm not crazy." The thought looped in her mind. "I didn't lose my keys. I didn't imagine the taste in the tea. He did this to me." For 2 years she had doubted her own sanity. She had looked in the mirror and seen a failure. Now she looked across the aisle and saw a monster. Ms. Caldwell was packing her briefcase. She didn't look at Richard. She stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice icy. "I must request a recess. I have a conflict of interest that has just arisen." "Request denied," Holloway snapped. "You are an officer of the court, Miss Caldwell. You will sit there and witness this." Holloway looked at Richard. Richard was pale, staring at the table, his jaw working furiously. "Mr. Miller," Holloway said, "I am going to ask you once. Is that your voice?" Richard stood up slowly. The charm was gone. The handsome face was twisted into a sneer of pure malice. He looked at Jessica, then at Sarah. "It doesn't matter," Richard spat. "It's inadmissible. You can't use it. I'll appeal this to the Supreme Court. You're a family court judge, Holloway. You don't have the jurisdiction to charge me with fraud." "You are correct," Holloway said, leaning back. "I don't have the jurisdiction to charge you with fraud, but I do have the jurisdiction to determine the best interests of the children. And I also have a telephone." Holloway pointed to the back of the courtroom. The double doors swung open. 2 men in dark suits walked in, followed by 4 uniformed officers. The man in front was Detective Mark Caney of the Major Crimes Unit. He held up a pair of handcuffs. "Richard Miller," Caney announced, his voice booming. "You are under arrest for the theft of $3 million wire fraud and suspicion of manslaughter regarding the death of Gregory Vance." Richard's eyes went wide. He bolted. It was a desperate, stupid move. He scrambled over the defense table, scattering papers everywhere, making a break for the side exit used by the jury. "Stop him!" Holloway shouted. Deputy Reynolds was faster. He tackled Richard halfway to the door, slamming him into the jury box railing. A sickening crunch echoed through the room, Richard's nose breaking against the wood. "Get off me! Do you know who I am?" Richard screamed, blood spraying onto the floor as the officers swarmed him. Sarah watched as the man who had controlled her every move for a decade was dragged kicking and screaming out of the courtroom. He looked small. He looked pathetic. When the doors finally closed, the room fell into a stunned silence. Judge Holloway took a deep breath. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked exhausted. He turned his eyes to Sarah. "Mrs. Miller," he said gently. Sarah stood up. Her legs felt weak. "I am granting you full sole legal and physical custody of Liam and Sophia, effective immediately. I am also issuing a lifetime restraining order against Mr. Miller. You will have your house back. You will have your life back." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. She turned to look at the witness stand. Jessica was still sitting there. She wasn't looking at Sarah. She was looking at the empty door where Richard had been dragged out, her expression a mix of victory and utter desolation. She had won, but she had destroyed herself to do it. The rain had stopped by the time Sarah walked out of the courthouse, but the pavement was still slick and black, reflecting the streetlights that were just beginning to flicker on. The air smelled of wet concrete and exhaust. Reporters were already swarming the bottom of the steps. The news of the courtroom brawl had leaked instantly. Sarah pulled her coat tighter around herself, David Ross shielding her from the flashing cameras. "Mrs. Miller, Mrs. Miller, did you know about the Mistress's true identity? How do you feel about your husband's arrest?" Sarah ignored them, pushing toward David's car, but before she could get in, a voice called out from the shadows of the side exit. "Sarah!" It was a voice she had hated for months, a voice that had taunted her in her nightmares. Sarah turned. Jessica was standing near a pillar, smoking a cigarette with trembling hands. She had removed the expensive red jacket, holding it bundled under her arm like dirty laundry. She looked younger now, stripped of the armor. Just a girl who had lost her father. David Ross put a hand on Sarah's arm. "You don't have to talk to her, Sarah. She's complicated." "It's okay, David," Sarah said softly. She walked over to where Jessica stood. Up close, Sarah could see the cracks in the porcelain. Jessica's makeup was smudged. Her eyes were hollow. "You saved my children," Sarah said. It was the only thing that mattered. Jessica took a long drag of the cigarette and exhaled smoke into the damp air. I didn't do it for your children, Sarah. I did it because he took my dad. He made my dad think he was worthless. My dad was a good man. He trusted the wrong people. You slept with my husband, Sarah said. The anger was there, simmering, but it was duller now. I had to get close, Jessica said, her voice hard. I had to become what he wanted. He likes broken things, Sarah. You know that. He liked you when you were weak. He liked me when I played the dumb, adoring girl. It was the only way to get the password to his cloud server. It took me 4 months to guess it. What was it? Sarah asked, a morbid curiosity taking over. Jessica looked at her, a bitter smile twisting her lips. Sarah 123. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. He used my name. He said it was because you were the key to his retirement fund, Jessica said. He had life insurance policies on you, Sarah. 3 of them. If the divorce didn't work out, if you didn't accidentally drink yourself to death. Jessica didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The accidents. The brake line on her car that had been faulty last winter. The gas stove left on. It hadn't just been gaslighting. He had been actively trying to liquidate her. Why tell me this now? Sarah whispered. Because the police are going to need you. Jessica flicked the cigarette butt into a puddle. I gave them the tapes, but Richard is slippery. He has money buried where even I couldn't find it. He's going to hire the best criminal defense team in the country. They're going to tear me apart on the stand. They'll call me a scorned lover, a liar, a corporate spy. They'll say I doctored the tapes. Jessica stepped closer, her eyes intense. I can't finish this alone, Sarah. I fired the bullet, but you have to drive the hearse. You have to testify. You have to tell them about the accidents, about the tea. You have to let them exhume your medical records. Sarah hesitated. She wanted to run. She wanted to grab Liam and Sophia and move to a cabin in Montana and never speak to another man again. If he gets out on bail, Jessica said quietly, he won't come for me. He knows I'm ready for him. He'll come for the kids. That was the trigger. The fear that had paralyzed Sarah for years suddenly calcified into something else. Rage. Pure maternal rage. He won't touch them, Sarah said. Her voice didn't shake. Then be ready, Jessica said. She turned to walk away. Wait, Sarah called out. Where will you go? Jessica paused. She looked back, and for a second, she looked like a ghost. Chloe Evans doesn't exist anymore. And Jessica Hayes, she died with her father. I'm just going to disappear, Sarah. It's what I'm good at. She walked into the night, the darkness swallowing her red coat. Sarah watched her go, realizing that the villain of her story had just handed her the sword she needed to kill the dragon. King County Jail is a bleak place, smelling of industrial cleaner and stale sweat. Richard Miller sat in a holding cell in the high-security wing. His suit was gone, replaced by an orange jumpsuit that was 2 sizes too small. His nose was bandaged, throbbing with a dull, rhythmic pain. He wasn't panicking anymore. Richard Miller didn't panic. He calculated. He sat on the metal cot staring at the graffiti scratched into the wall. He was running the numbers in his head. The tapes were bad. Very bad. But tapes could be challenged. Voice modulation technology was advanced. His lawyer could argue deep fake. The confession about Gregory Vance was vague. He hadn't said, I killed him. He said, I gave him a push. That was metaphor. That was business. The door buzzed and clanked open. A guard stepped in. Lawyers here. Richard smiled. Finally. He expected Miss Caldwell, or perhaps a senior partner from her firm. But the man who walked in wasn't from a high-end Seattle firm. He was a man Richard had kept on retainer for special projects for years. A man named Elias Thorne. Elias was small, balding, and wore a suit that cost more than the judge's annual salary. He didn't carry a briefcase. He carried a single manila envelope. "Elias!" Richard said, standing up. "Thank God. Get me out of here. The bail hearing is in an hour. I can post 5 million if I have to. Access the Cayman accounts." Elias didn't smile. He sat down on the metal stool, bolted to the floor, and placed the envelope on the table. "Sit down, Richard," Elias said softly. Richard's smile faltered. "What is this? Where's the paperwork?" "The Cayman accounts are frozen," Elias said. Richard felt the blood rush in his ears. "What? That's impossible. They're encrypted. Only I have the keys." "You had the keys," Elias corrected. "But it seems your house guest, Ms. Evans, or whatever she calls herself, was more thorough than you thought. She didn't just record you, Richard. She mirrored your hard drive. When you were arrested, an automatic trigger sent the data to the FBI, the IRS, and the SEC. The accounts were frozen 40 minutes ago." Richard slumped against the wall. The money was his escape hatch. Without it, he was just another inmate. "Fix it," Richard snarled. "You know people. Bribe someone. Make the evidence disappear." "It's too loud, Richard," Elias said, shaking his head. "This is on the national news. The judge's sentence that shocked the world. You're trending on Twitter. Nobody is going to touch this. You're radioactive." Elias pushed the envelope across the table. "What is this?" Richard asked. "My resignation," Elias said. "And a bill for past services. I suggest you plead guilty. They have you on everything, Richard. The fraud, the embezzlement. And they're opening the file on Vance. If they exhume the body and find the sedative you mentioned on the tape, it's murder one." Richard stared at the envelope. His world was collapsing. The walls of the cell seemed to be closing in. "You can't leave me," Richard whispered. "I know things about you, Elias. I know about the port deal." Elias stood up. He walked to the door and knocked for the guard. He looked back at Richard with cold, dead eyes. "You're a smart man, Richard. But you made one classic mistake. You underestimated the women. You thought your wife was weak, and you thought your mistress was stupid. You never looked at them as people. You only saw them as assets. And when assets malfunction, they tend to explode." The door opened. Elias walked out. Richard was left alone in the silence of the cell. He began to pace. He wasn't done. He still had one card left. A card he had saved for the absolute worst-case scenario. It wasn't money. It wasn't a lawyer. It was a secret buried in the foundation of the house Sarah was now living in. If he was going down, he was going to take everything with him. He went to the payphone on the wall. He had one phone call. He didn't call a lawyer. He punched in a number he had memorized years ago, a number that belonged to a man who didn't have a name, only a price. The line rang 3 times. "Yeah," a raspy voice answered. "It's Miller." Richard said, his voice low. "Execute Order 66 on the lakeside property." "You sure?" the voice asked. "The wife and kids are in there." Richard closed his eyes. He saw Sarah's face in the courtroom. He saw the way the judge had looked at him. He saw the end of his empire. "Burn it," Richard said. "Burn it all." The Miller estate sat on the edge of Lake Washington, a sprawling modernist structure of glass and steel that Richard had designed to impress his clients. To Sarah, it had always felt more like a museum than a home cold, echoing, and terrifyingly open to the darkness of the water. It was 1:00 a.m. 3 hours had passed since Richard's phone call in the jail cell. Inside the house, the silence was absolute. Sarah had finally gotten Liam and Sophia to sleep. They were curled up in Sarah's bed, tangled in the duvet, exhausted from the confusion of the last 2 days. Sarah sat in the armchair in the corner of the room, watching them. She held a baseball bat across her lap, a ridiculous, heavy wooden thing she had found in the garage. It felt primitive against the high-tech security system blinking on the wall, but it was the only thing that felt real. She didn't know about the phone call. She didn't know about the man currently cutting the perimeter fence at the bottom of the garden. She just had an instinct, a vibration in the air that told her the nightmare wasn't quite over. Down by the water, the man with the raspy voice, a contract cleaner named Victor, moved with the silent efficiency of a ghost. He knew the codes. Richard had given him the master override years ago for a security audit. Victor didn't enjoy killing women and children, but he enjoyed the $50,000 waiting in a locker at the bus station. And he feared Richard Miller's associates more than he feared the police. Victor slipped through the patio doors. He didn't break the glass. He simply punched in the code. Beep, 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 click. The alarm didn't sound. The green light turned red. Disarmed, Victor moved to the kitchen. His instructions were specific. Burn it all. That meant an electrical fire or a gas explosion, something that looked like a tragic accident caused by deferred maintenance. Richard had been setting up this narrative for months, neglecting repairs on purpose. Victor opened his bag and pulled out a wrench. He knelt by the commercial-grade gas range. He wasn't going to light a match. He was going to loosen the main valve, let the house fill with gas for an hour, and then set a timed igniter on the counter. By the time it sparked, he would be 2 counties away. Hiss! The sound was faint, like a snake in the grass. The smell of rotten eggs McCaptain began to seep into the air. Upstairs, Sora's eyes snapped open. She hadn't been sleeping, just drifting in a haze of adrenaline crash. She sniffed the air. Gas. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at the security panel on the wall. It was green. System armed. But the smell was getting stronger. She stood up, gripping the bat. Don't panic, she told herself. Just a leak. An old pipe. But then she heard it. A soft, wet squeak of rubber shoes on the marble floor downstairs. Someone was in the house. Sarah didn't scream. The Sarah from 2 days ago might have screamed. The Sarah who had sat in that courtroom and watched her husband's empire crumble was done screaming. She was a mother now, in the most primal sense of the word. She moved to the bed and shook Liam awake. "Baby," she whispered, her voice fierce and low. "Wake up. Don't make a sound." Liam blinked, groggy. "Mom, grab your sister," Sarah commanded. "Go into the bathroom. Lock the door. Do not open it unless you hear my voice. Do you understand?" Liam saw the look in her eyes, the terrifying feral intensity, and nodded. He dragged a sleeping Sophia off the bed and pulled her into the master bath. The lock clicked. Sarah turned to the bedroom door. She took a deep breath, inhaling the faint scent of gas that was drifting up the ventilation shafts. She tightened her grip on the bat. She crept into the hallway. The house was a cavern of shadows. She looked over the railing to the living room below. She saw him. A figure in black kneeling by the kitchen island, messing with a small electronic device. The smell of gas was nauseating now. Sarah realized with a jolt of horror what he was doing. He wasn't robbing them. He was turning the house into a bomb. She didn't think. She didn't calculate. She reacted. Sarah Miller ran. She didn't run away. She ran down the stairs. She moved with a speed she didn't know she possessed her bare feet, silent on the plush runner. Victor heard the rush of air a second too late. He turned the igniter in his hand, his eyes widening behind his ski mask. "Hey!" he shouted, reaching for the gun in his waistband. He never got there. Sarah swung the bat with every ounce of rage she had suppressed for 10 years. It connected with Victor's outstretched arm with a sickening crack. The gun skittered across the polished floor, sliding under the refrigerator. Victor howled, clutching his arm. He was big, heavy, and professional, but he was surprised. He lashed out with his good hand, backhanding Sarah across the face. She flew backward, crashing into the kitchen island. Her lip split. The taste of blood filled her mouth. The bat clattered away. "Stupid bee!" Victor growled, breathless. He kicked the bat away. He grabbed the igniter from the counter. The gas was thick now, making the air ripple. "You want to die awake, fine." He raised the igniter. All he had to do was press the button. The spark would ignite the cloud of gas accumulating near the ceiling. Sarah looked at him. She was dizzy. She was bleeding, but she saw the knife block on the counter behind him. "Do it!" Sarah spat, blood staining her teeth. "Blow us up. You'll die too." Victor hesitated. He looked at the gas. He looked at the door. He calculated the distance. That hesitation was all Sarah needed. She grabbed the heavy ceramic bowl of fruit on the island, the one Richard insisted be stocked with organic lemons for aesthetics, and hurled it at his face. It smashed into his nose. Victor stumbled back, blinded by tears and juice. Sarah lunged for the knife block. She pulled out the chef's knife, but before she could turn, the front door exploded inward. It wasn't an explosion of fire, it was a battering ram. "Police, get down! Get down!" A swarm of tactical lights blinded them both. Detective Mark Kane charged into the kitchen, his weapon drawn, followed by 3 SWAT officers. Victor raised his hands, dropping the igniter. It bounced on the floor harmlessly. "Don't shoot!" Victor screamed. "Gas, there's gas. Secure the suspect. Ventilate the house. Move." Caney barked orders. 2 officers tackled Victor, pinning him to the floor. Caney holstered his weapon and ran to Sarah. "Mrs. Miller, are you hurt?" Sarah stood there, the knife still clutched in her hand, her chest heaving. She looked at the detective, then at the man on the floor, then up towards the bedroom where her children were hiding. She dropped the knife. It clattered loudly in the sudden silence. "My kids!" She gasped, her legs finally giving out. "They're in the bathroom." Caney caught her before she hit the floor. "We've got them. You're safe." "We heard the call, Sarah. We've been listening to Richard's line since he arrived at the jail. We were 5 minutes behind this guy." Sarah looked at Victor, who was being dragged out in handcuffs. "Tell Richard," Sarah whispered, wiping the blood from her lip. "Tell him he missed." 6 months later. The courtroom was packed. It was the sentencing hearing for the state of Washington versus Richard Miller. The trial had been the most watched event in the state's history. The evidence was overwhelming: the tapes from Jessica, the financial records from the mirrored hard drive, the testimony of the hitman Victor, who flipped on Richard for a plea deal, and finally the testimony of Sarah Miller. Richard sat at the defense table. He looked skeletal. The arrogance was gone, eroded by months in solitary confinement. He wore a standard-issue jumpsuit. He wouldn't look at the gallery. Judge Frederick Halloway sat on the bench. He looked older, too. This case had taken a toll on everyone. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at Richard. Richard Miller. Halloway began, his voice echoing in the silent room. "You have been found guilty of 24 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of money laundering, 1 count of solicitation of capital murder, and 1 count of manslaughter in the 1st degree for the death of Gregory Vance." Halloway paused. He looked at Sarah, who was sitting in the front row. She looked healthy. Her hair was down, shining. She wore a simple white blouse. She held the hand of her new attorney, a fierce woman named David Ross's partner. "In my career, Halloway continued, I have seen men do terrible things for money. I have seen crimes of passion. But I have rarely seen a man so methodically attempt to destroy the very people he was sworn to protect. You treated your family like a bad investment you wanted to write off. Richard stared at the table. You thought you were the smartest man in the room, Mr. Miller. You thought you could engineer reality. But you forgot the most basic law of nature. Nothing is stronger than the will of a mother fighting for her children, and nothing is more dangerous than the truth when it has nowhere left to hide. Holloway picked up his gavel. For the financial crimes, I sentence you to 20 years. For the manslaughter of Gregory Vance, I sentence you to 15 years. And for the attempted murder of Sarah Liam and Sophia Miller, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. These sentences are to run consecutively. Bang! The gavel strike was final, a thunderclap that ended the storm. Richard didn't move. He didn't scream. He simply closed his eyes as the bailiffs pulled him to his feet. As he was led away, he looked back. He looked for Sarah. She was watching him. She didn't look angry. She didn't look sad. She looked indifferent. He was no longer the monster under her bed. He was just a memory, a ghost in an orange suit. Sarah turned her back on him and walked out of the courtroom. Outside, the spring sun was shining. The cherry blossoms were blooming along the courthouse steps. Sarah walked down the stairs. A woman was waiting for her by a park bench near the fountain. It was Jessica. She looked different. She had cut her hair short and dyed it a soft brown. She wore jeans and a sweater. She looked like a college student, not a corporate spy. "You came," Sarah said, stopping in front of her. "I had to hear it," Jessica said. "Life without parole, it's over." "It's over," Sarah agreed. "I'm leaving today," Jessica said, clutching her bag. "Moving back east, going to finish my dad's degree. Try to be normal." Sarah reached into her purse. She pulled out a small envelope. "I found this in the safe deposit box, the one the FBI let me access after the assets were unfrozen." She handed it to Jessica. Jessica opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It was old, worn at the edges. It showed a young Gregory Vance holding a baby girl on his shoulders. They were both laughing. Jessica's hand flew to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes. "I thought this was lost. I thought Richard burned everything." "He missed a few things," Sarah said with a small smile. "Thank you, Jessica, for the tape, for everything." Jessica wiped her eyes. "You saved yourself, Sarah. I just gave you the match." "Maybe," Sarah said. She looked toward the parking lot where Liam and Sophia were waiting in her new car, a sensible SUV bought with her own money from her new job. "But we both burned the house down," Jessica laughed, a wet, choked sound. "Yeah, we did." They stood there for a moment, two women bound by a tragedy that had forged them into something stronger. They weren't friends exactly. They were soldiers who had fought in the same trench. "Goodbye, Jessica," Sarah said. "Goodbye, Sarah," Jessica replied. Sarah turned and walked toward her children. She didn't look back. She got into the car and Liam asked, "Is it done?" "Mom?" Sarah looked at her son. She looked at the courthouse receding in the rearview mirror. "Yes, baby," she said, putting the car in gear. "It's done. Let's go get ice cream." As they drove away, the sun broke fully through the clouds, illuminating the road ahead. It was bright, it was clear, and for the first time in a decade, the road belonged entirely to her. And that is the story of how Sarah Miller and a courageous mistress named Jessica took down a tyrant. It's a reminder that even when you feel powerless, even when the world is gaslighting you, the truth is a weapon that never jams. Judge Holloway's sentence didn't just punish a criminal, it validated a survivor. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit the like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want more stories of justice, betrayal, and redemption, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. What would you have done in Sarah's shoes? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe and see you in the next video.